afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this installment of the Exploring Sustainable Seafood virtual panel series. My name is Kim Thompson, and I am the director of the Aquarium of the Pacific's Seafood for the Future program. Seafood farming is not new. In fact, it's been practiced for more than 4,000 years and started in China. The earliest record of seafood farming indicates that the first species farmed was carp, which is a freshwater species. Throughout this series, we've talked a lot about farming in the marine environment, but that's only half of the story. Half of the seafood farmed in the world comes from freshwater sources. And in the US, freshwater farmed fish and seafood makes up 90% of the total farmed seafood coming from domestic production. Today we're going to be joined by two amazing experts who have spent their careers researching freshwater farming. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Gary Fornshell, Extension Professor Emeritus at the University of Idaho and running his own consulting firm, Aquaculture Results, LLC, and Carole Engle, Adjunct Faculty at Virginia Tech University, who is also apparently not able to stay retired and is running her own consulting firm, Engle-Stone Aquatics, LLC. You can find their bios and additional resources from this and other discussions in this series at aquariumofpacific.org. So let's dig in and get to know our panelists a little bit. Gary, we're going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, and is what you're doing now anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied to college?
Well, thank you, Kim. I just retired 2 months ago from University of Idaho Extension. I was an aquaculture extension educator, and with almost 28 years of experience at Idaho. And so I am retired, and although I do have a consulting company right now, I haven't done any work with that consulting company. So primarily what I did was here in Idaho was work with the Idaho aquaculture industry in addressing issues of concerns that they had, primarily regulatory, environmental issues, and then other things such as feed management and fish health management. So, and as far as what I wound up doing as a career, was now we're close to what I studied in college. When I first went to college, I had in mind becoming an animal behaviorist to study primates in the African continent. And when I first heard the word aquaculture, I didn't even know what that word meant. I had to ask, what does that word mean? And I was told it was fish farming, and I wound up going into the Peace Corps, and was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and that set me off in the career of aquaculture that's been very rewarding.
That's great. And so just to clarify, throughout your career then, your job was really to help apply the science in the real world.
That's correct. Bring the university to the farmers. Bring the research-based information, research-based educational programs to help them improve their operations, their profitability. Yes.
Wonderful. And Carole, how about you? What are you doing in your retired life? What were you doing in your career? And how is what you're doing now? How does that compare to what you thought you were going to be doing when you were 18-year-old Carole first applying for college?
Well, my career really has focused on economics and marketing of aquaculture throughout, from the perspective of research, but also extension and outreach and working with producers from a teaching perspective. I've had opportunities to work with aquaculture producers really around the world, but in the last 5-6 years, or maybe longer than that, I've really focused on working mostly with U.S. aquaculture producers. Now through the consulting company, I continue to do the things I really enjoy doing the most, and that's either research or working with producers to help them try to solve some of the thorny economics and marketing issues that they're facing. When I was 18 years old, I had no clue what I wanted to do. I was interested in many, many things. I was one of those students in college that really could not choose a major. I was interested in many, many things. I never heard about aquaculture throughout my undergraduate days at all. It was after I graduated that I heard about aquaculture. It was really when I began exploring opportunities for graduate school and trying to decide the next step that I was going to take. When I found out about aquaculture, I started reading about it. I fell in love with it. I went to graduate school to focus on aquaculture. While in graduate school, the fascination and love for it just grew. It just grew and grew. What's not to love about raising an environmentally sustainable and delicious, healthy sort of product? I just fell in love with it, and I'm still in love with it. But in graduate school, the other side of me also kicked in. I grew up in a small family business. It was not a farm, but it was a small family business. And so economics just always made sense to me. And the questions that kept coming to mind as I was studying aquaculture in graduate school were the economics ones. You know, what makes an aquaculture business successful? I was amazed at the idea that you could make a living doing something like raising fish in ponds or raceways, but those questions just really drove me. And so I ended up becoming really a hybrid. My major professor in graduate school was an agricultural economist, but I was in aquaculture, studying aquaculture sorts of things, and I became a true hybrid. I started taking economics and marketing courses, and throughout my career have sort of combined those things together. So it's just really been a privilege for me to be able to work with fish farmers across the world. I have developed enormous respect for aquaculture producers that make a living from aquaculture. And it's just been a real privilege for me to work with them and continue to work with them now.
And that's a great example of a career that was built on, and something we've discussed in this series is that need for interdisciplinary actions to move forward and understanding how these different systems work more holistically.
That's an important point, and we need more hybrid aquaculture economists from my perspective as well. Economists need to understand how to raise fish and what farmers have to do to raise fish successfully, but farmers also need somebody to help them with their finances and economics and marketing questions and all sorts of other things. So we do need more interdisciplinary sorts of individuals, absolutely.
So you heard that, folks. For those of you who are struggling with organic chemistry, there are other options to contribute to sustainable food systems and conservation. All right, so much of the current dialogue around aquaculture, particularly in the media, has really been about growing and expanding marine aquaculture in the marine environment and whether or not we should be doing that. But aquaculture is not new in the United States, and some farms have actually been operating here for decades. So, Gary, can you tell us a little bit about the different types of farming that are currently underway in freshwater systems, and how long have they been there?
Sure, Kim. There are about 4 common types of aquaculture production systems used for freshwater aquaculture here in the United States. They include ponds, flow-through raceways, recirculating aquaculture systems, also known as RAS, and aquaponics. In the United States, ponds are the most common type of aquaculture production system. They're primarily located in the southeastern United States and used for catfish culture. But they also include a number of other species. Almost all species of freshwater aquaculture species are grown in ponds. These would include crawfish, tilapia, trout, hybrid striped bass, freshwater shrimp, bait fish, sport fish. In the United States, ponds represent about 80% of production by volume, and approximately 77% of farm gate sales for freshwater aquaculture production. The systems that I worked with primarily here in Idaho are flow-through raceway systems used predominantly for salmonid aquaculture, so salmon and trout. So these are systems where water is diverted through a raceway, which is essentially a linear structure, typically made out of concrete, where water is diverted into it and then passes out through it and is treated before it's discharged back into the receiving stream. Recirculating aquaculture systems represent about 15% of all the farms, freshwater farms in the United States. And they are closed systems where the water is treated both biologically and mechanically. And you have to provide all the essential environmental services for the fish that would include appropriate temperature, sufficient oxygen, and mitigation of the metabolic wastes that are produced from consuming the feed. And then you have aquaponics, which are the integration of plant culture and fish culture. Those are relatively new systems. They've probably been around for about 20 years or so. And they represent maybe about 3% of all the freshwater farms located in the United States. Ponds, there are farms that have probably been around for 50 years or more. Some of the earliest catfish farms began in the late 50s and early 60s. Prior to that, Homer Swingle, who was at Auburn University, began researching farm pond management back in the late 30s to provide a source of food locally for people. And from that effort, there were a number of farm ponds constructed across the United States with trout farms and flow-through systems. The first trout farm here in Twin Falls was built back in 1909, so over 100 years ago. It's no longer in existence, but we do have existing farms that began back in the late 20s and 1930s. So it's been around for a relatively long time, although, for practical purposes, commercial aquaculture, began predominantly back in the 1960s, but we've had farms that go back quite a bit. As far as I know, with recirculating aquaculture systems, one of the oldest ones goes back until the early 90s. That was established back in about 1991 or so.
So we have this established freshwater aquaculture or farming sector established already in the U.S. It's been here commercially for 50 plus years. We know that it actually has been going on for about 100 years. And there's a diverse portfolio then of different production methods and species. So we just got a pretty good picture about the diversity of the different types of aquaculture and freshwater systems in the U.S. So Carole, what role do these systems play in contributing to the global seafood supply, and why is their role so important?
There are lots of ways to answer that, and there are different aspects to that sort of question. But as I've had an opportunity to visit a lot of these farms and the communities that they live in, what's obvious to me is that these farms are located in very rural areas, and they play just an incredibly important role in many, many ways in these rural communities and areas. In some situations in the South with the catfish industry, in Idaho with trout, in the state of Washington with shellfish production, these are some of the leading businesses, although they're farms, are some of the leading businesses in those areas and are the major contributors to the local economy. So they're just vitally important on a local scale. But the importance of these industries on the local and state levels goes well beyond just providing the food that people want to eat and providing high quality food for people to want to eat. It goes far beyond it. I think it's really important to understand that the majority of U.S. aquaculture businesses, they really are businesses, but they're also family farms. That's very, very important. It's the family working together on the farm that put in extremely long hours of very hard work under all sorts of conditions. The care that they take of their animals is really vital. There's a work ethic that goes along with farmers that raise animals like this. And so these are family farms. Now, an aquaculture fish farm is a more complex kind of a farm to run than many other types of agriculture. So it takes fairly sophisticated management to be successful. As such, the folks that are successful tend to also be true leaders in their communities. There's a very important social contribution of fish farms across the United States as well.
So to make sure that I'm capturing what you said, so in addition to providing that high quality source of nutrients and protein, freshwater aquaculture systems can play a really key role in supporting local economies, and a lot of them are family run and operated businesses. It's it's ingrained into the culture, and it also allows them to adapt to changing conditions such as the decline of wild fish stocks in some of their freshwater systems.
Absolutely. There have been a number of studies that have measured the economic contributions, and it's astounding to me to look at those because the aquaculture sectors that I've looked at may support hundreds, literally hundreds of other economic sectors. I've measured one recent study in Pennsylvania that counted more than 400 different sectors of the Pennsylvania economy were supported by the farms in that particular state. So the impact is just tremendous of these businesses. Part of it is because they do source so many of their supplies locally, both the feed and employees and boxes and all sorts of services. The other interesting part, watching these industries grow in different areas, is that whole new businesses have been developed and have grown up around aquaculture. In fact, one study we did in Arkansas showed that the economic impact was substantial from the farms, but there was an even greater economic impact and activity developed by all these sort of support industries that grew up around the fish farms that were developing in that area. So it generates new business opportunities that all contributes to economic development.
Right, and that's a really important point that has been brought up before, is that a lot of times we focus just on the farmers themselves, but the reality is there's a whole supply chain and there's a whole chain of actors engaged in this that can both be part of the impact, but they can also be part of the benefit piece.
Absolutely. And these are new supply chains that the farms themselves have had to create over the years. Because this is a new economic, relatively new, even if a farm is 100 or 40 years old or more, this is still relatively new activity. So the farms themselves have created these supply chains that have just expanded the resilience of these communities in an economic sense and in a social sense as well.
So we've learned a little bit kind of, bigger picture of the different types of freshwater aquaculture in terms of methods and species. We know that it is an important contributor to the seafood supply, not just, again, that high quality food, but then also supporting those local economies. But there's also another piece to aquaculture production, which is conservation. In fact, and Gary, I'm going to start with you on this one of my favorite species, it was actually on a trip with you with the Sea Grant Extension folks that I finally got to see sturgeon up live and up close. But sturgeon is a great example of how farming has actually contributed to conservation. So can you give us some examples of conservation aquaculture, and how are they contributing to larger efforts to conserve species and habitat?
Okay. So here in southern Idaho, on the Snake River, we have the white sturgeon, which is an important species. And due to a variety of changes in both water management on the Snake River and the construction of dams, the white sturgeon is listed as a species of least concern. There are areas, stretches on the Snake River where there is no recruitment because of loss of habitat and because of dams. There isn't sufficient water velocity that's necessary for the fish to spawn. So in the late 80s, in the state of Idaho, they developed the Idaho Sturgeon Cooperative, which was between the Idaho Fish and Game Department, the College of Southern Idaho, and the Idaho aquaculture industry. And they decided to take sexually mature sturgeon out of the Snake River here, spawn those fish at the College of Southern Idaho, and that technology on how to spawn those fish developed from research that was funded from the USDA through the Western Regional Aquaculture Center and was conducted at UC Davis in California. So they transferred that technology from that research here to Southern Idaho, spawned those fish, did the early rearing, and then when those fish were about a year or so old and maybe about 9 to 10 inches, 11 inches long, Idaho Fish and Game could take up to a particular percentage, as much as 50% or more of the fish, and pit tag those fish and stock them back out into the Snake River. And then the remainder of the fish were then sold to the producers here in Idaho that were interested in looking at a new species for aquaculture. And as a result of that cooperative, which has been going on since the late 80s, thousands of sturgeon have been stocked back out into the Snake River. Idaho Fish and Game has even stocked sturgeon in areas above Twin Falls on the Snake River where they weren't native, and has contributed to a new sports fishery there, new angling opportunities for Idaho citizens. And then here in southern Idaho, that cooperative has led to the establishment of a new aquaculture enterprise, the culture of white sturgeon, both for meat and caviar. And if you look at sturgeon production and caviar production here in the United States and then across the world, what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, because of wild sturgeon being overexploited through both fishing and illegal fishing and the black market and habitat loss and pollution in the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, is that there's been a prohibition on using these wild sturgeon both for meat and particularly caviar. So aquaculture sturgeon and caviar, which protects the wild fish, is now supplying the consumer demand for sturgeon meat and more importantly for that caviar. So it's been a win-win for everybody. It's developed a whole new enterprise for aquaculture producers, and it's helped the wild fish by increasing their population in the river.
So we just learned a lot about how aquaculture could contribute to sturgeon conservation. And one of those key components that you were just talking about was the hatchery piece. But hatcheries are also a really important function for some other species like trout and salmon. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And before I begin, hatcheries is a term that, it's used interchangeably, particularly with flow-through systems. So I think, hatcheries can mean primarily federal, state, and tribal, flow-through systems that grow fish. And then we also use them in the commercial sector. But this in context, as far as conservation efforts with trout and salmon, particularly steelhead trout and Pacific salmon, those hatcheries are mostly federal, state, and tribal that are involved with producing those fish that get stocked back out in the wild. In Alaska, where we have private nonprofit hatcheries, they've been around for numerous decades, they contribute about 40% of the salmon that are harvested in the North Pacific. And that's a huge fishery up there in the North Pacific and also Bering Sea. And it shows you the importance of these hatcheries, that where they spawn the fish, they do the early rearing, the fish are then put out in net pens and saltwater, and then a particular size, they're released out into the wild, and then they're captured later on, as adult market-sized fish. On the West Coast, hatcheries contribute about 80 to 90% of the salmon that are commercially caught and recreationally caught. So those hatcheries are a very important component, not only for conservation purposes, but also for economic activity, for commercial fisheries and for recreational fisheries.
So I'm starting to see this theme between balancing conservation and the economic needs of the population. I'm sure that makes Carole very happy. So we just learned about the sturgeon and the potential conservation to the species to relieve pressure on them. You have the hatchery system to create more sturgeon, and then you can relieve pressure on the wild capture fisheries through caviar production in the farm systems.
Yeah, so essentially now, from what I understand, is that the supply of caviar now is actually greater than the demand. And that's all because of farming through aquaculture.
So it can be a very powerful tool to help alleviate pressure and support conservation. And so on that note, so another pressure point is the aquarium trade and getting fish for aquariums. And freshwater aquaculture actually plays a really important role in helping to alleviate some of that pressure. So Carole, can you walk us through a little bit about what the aquaculture for the aquarium trade looks like and why it's important?
Sure. The international trade in tropicals and ornamentals is really quite an interesting business. It's also interesting to me, it's very large, of course, but it's also interesting that the majority of global demand for aquarium fish is right here in the United States. I've seen some statistics that it constitutes from half to 2/3 of all global demand for ornamentals is right here in the United States. The great news is that for the freshwater ornamentals, the numbers that I've seen are that about 90% of all freshwater ornamental fish are now raised on farms. So obviously that does take the pressure off capture fish. With marine ornamentals, it's a little bit different. Marine fish are much more difficult to raise. For many years, and when I was in grad school, there really was very little known about how to do it. But we've seen tremendous research advancements in recent years to cultivate all sorts of marine species, but including a lot of marine ornamentals. Just to give you some sort of an estimate of the size, I've seen numbers that in terms of marine fish harvested from the wild for the ornamental trade of as high as 16 to 24 million marine fish are harvested a year for the ornamental trade. So that really does create a lot of concern about what that means for the wild populations of those fish. But research advancements have really been able to switch a lot of that, more and more species being raised on farms in captivity. There's a really good example that I just really enjoy. I'm sure that most people have seen or heard about Finding Nemo, and Dory is a favorite. You know, there's no question Dory is a blue tang. Well, in the last several years, researchers have been able to take the blue tang and not just spawn it in captivity, but get it through those really critical early larval stages. Often with marine finfish, that's the big stumbling block, is figuring out what it's going to take to get them through the larval stages successfully with a high % of survival. The researchers at the Tropical Fish Laboratory at University of Florida accomplished this several years ago for the blue tang, and accomplished it before the movie came out with Dory. So the demand for blue tangs was really increasing because of those Disney movies. But now farms are beginning to be able to raise and cultivate blue tangs and supply those from farms and take the pressure off the wild. There are many other examples of those kind of advances with ornamental fish, but there's no question aquaculture is playing a huge role in changing that supply from pressure from wild stocks, many of which are severely overfished right now, and changing that to a farm supply that ensures the continuity of these species over time.
That's great. And again, in the series, I always learn something new, and I didn't realize that the U.S. was such a major, had such a major demand for the aquarium trade fish. That is.
I'm not sure why that is, if we're just more stressed here and need the calming effect of aquarium fish or whatever, but that may be the case. Maybe we just work too hard in the U.S. I don't know.
But we're going to shift gears a little bit. And Gary, we're going to start with you on this one. And I want to discuss the respective roles of freshwater and marine aquaculture. You know, how are they different, and how do they complement each other? Gary, we'll start with you.
That's a good question. I would start with the latter part of your question, is they complement each other. They both contribute to our domestic seafood supply, and so that's important in providing a safe, wholesome, healthy food product that generates economic activity, that provides a job, and contributes to food security. So they're both important. The other point I would make is that and we brought this up several times, both with the diversity of production methods, the diversity of species, grown in aquaculture production systems. That diversity is a reflection of consumer demand for those types of products. And so both marine aquaculture and freshwater aquaculture provide the products that consumers demand, that they're looking for that diversity. So in terms of the production systems, or looking at where the aquaculture occurs, the majority of aquaculture in the United States, we discussed, is freshwater aquaculture, and we do have an important marine aquaculture sector that's dominated primarily by shellfish aquaculture. And as you know, you discussed in previous panels, the recent efforts to establish marine aquaculture in the United States. So marine aquaculture, probably requires more of a social license, because it's in public waters compared to say pond aquaculture. I think maybe more controversial, just because that's been the focus on marine aquaculture over the last several decades throughout, primarily outside the United States, and so I think it generates more anti-aquaculture passion here in the United States. So we can always see that with recent efforts to promote marine aquaculture, some of the backlash that we've seen here in the country.
Marine aquaculture and freshwater aquaculture do complement each other in terms of providing that nutritious source of food. They provide jobs, they support local economies, they can both be built into local cultures. But marine aquaculture tends to have a little bit more obstacle on the social perception side, because it tends to be a shared resource versus the more privatized ponds. And
correct, yeah. And they're both important here in the United States. They're both necessary. So and if you look at for instance with salmon, they get their start on land-based aquaculture. In terms of the spawning and the early rearing before they become smolts and put out net pins. So there's actually a direct production connection between some of the species that are grown in marine waters to get their start in freshwater. So on land, I should say. So
it's clear that we need both of these systems. Now the question, though, is, do we need to do it in the U.S.? So I think what we really need to understand first, Carole, then, is how much of this product that's currently being produced is actually staying in the U.S.?
What's raised in the United States is primarily consumed here. There's very little of U.S. aquaculture that's being exported. The demand is right here. I think we all have to understand that the United States has consistently been one of the largest seafood markets in the entire world. We flip-flop a little bit back with Japan and some other countries, but the U.S. has consistently been one of the biggest seafood markets in the world. Not so much because we eat a lot per capita, because we don't, and we need to be eating more seafood per capita to be healthier, but because we have so many people and we have a higher income level that allows people the luxury of affording seafood of different types. So we are a very large market. The U.S. industry, you look at the major species, you look at shellfish, almost all of that is local. There is export of shellfish to Asia and other countries, but the majority is sold right here at home. The same for catfish and trout and other major segments of U.S. aquaculture. So the market is here. And the question is, do we in the United States want more of what we eat and what we use from seafood to be raised in the United States, or do we want to continue to import it? We're importing a tremendous percentage. You see different numbers, and some people quibble, but they're all up in the upper 80s and into the 90% of the seafood that we consume and what we use is imported. Much of that is coming from countries that do not have the regulatory structure and system and enforcement that we have in the United States.
So as you just mentioned, there's clearly a demand for the seafood. a lot of the farm seafood in the U.S., fresh and marine sources, are staying in the U.S., but the farmers are still facing obstacles. So Gary, we're going to start with you on this one. What would you say is the one biggest obstacle for growing and expanding aquaculture in the U.S.?
I would say regulations. And, Carole, has studied the impact of regulations on farm costs for many years. And we collaborated over the last about 4 or 5 years now on the impact of regulations on salmonid farms, primarily trout farms here in the United States. And, prior to that, Carole and colleagues looked at the impact of regulations on bait fish and sport fish. And, the general trend, is certainly that what this research has shown is that, on-farm regulatory cost burden is substantial. And it's also negatively affected the U.S. Aquaculture industry in its ability to respond to strong demand for its products. For example, with trout here in the United States, about 50% of the trout that we consume is imported. And so that indicates there's a very high demand for trout. But because of regulations, what we've seen from this research and survey of the trout farmers is that there are regulatory constraints for them to expand to meet this consumer demand. So they can't meet that demand that consumers want. And that results in back in 2018, that was a trade deficit of over $140 million. So substantial impact. So not only do we see that costs are increasing, on-farm costs because of these regulations, but we also see that there's lost revenue because of these regulations, whether it's lost markets or reduced production or foregone sales from regulatory barriers that prevent expansion of these farms to meet that consumer demand. And then research has also suggests that the regulatory system has contributed to the decline in the number of aquaculture farms, and particularly here in Idaho, we've seen the decline from about the mid-90s into the 2000s. A number of particularly smaller farms that have gone out of business, and the research has also shown that the regulatory cost burden is substantially greater on these smaller farms, which are large in number throughout the United States. Whether it's catfish or trout or tilapia or what have you. As Carole mentioned earlier, these aquaculture farms are family-owned farms, and so they tend to be relatively small. And so this regulatory burden is much greater on them than it would be on these larger farms that we have a few of across the country.
Carole, is your answer also regulations, or do you have a different answer to the one biggest obstacle for expanding aquaculture in the U.S.?
Regulations and the regulatory framework and this broad discussion we've been having towards the end of this is still the biggest issue for marine aquaculture. To take another step, as the economist in me chimes in, marine aquaculture is going to be, when we start talking offshore especially, shellfish in coastal areas, the shellfish producers have been there for a century doing a really good job raising shellfish. They know how to do it. We start talking about offshore, we're talking about, and that part of marine aquaculture, we're talking about new businesses altogether and new production systems altogether. Many of these are highly experimental. There are a lot of models out there that are very exciting, but that's a lot of investment, and there's also a lot of risk, and there are a lot of unknowns about all of that. And so in addition to the kind of regulatory part that we've talked about and working through that and streamlining it and being reasonable about it and basing it on science and not some sort of ideology. But in addition to that, I think there's some other kind of step in between where we need some investment in pilot scale kinds of operations or maybe support for those that are trying to do it and work out the kinks of some of these to help with R&D. One of the concerns that I have generally about U.S. aquaculture is the support for R&D these days, because we've seen a decline in the number of extension specialists in aquaculture in those positions, seen a number of those not be refilled after someone retires, and we've seen a decline in the amount of extension assistants for aquaculture generally across the United States. And I've seen the role of good extension specialists and what they've meant to help farmers do that R&D on farms. So that's another aspect that I think that we really, really need. But almost for marine offshore is going to need to be some kind of a way to help attract some investment, not necessarily federal dollars, but maybe assistance to bring in some of this investment capital to develop some pilot scale kinds of projects with intensive R&D support and monitoring to really work out and fine tune some of these, so these will end up being viable businesses. I think they're just it's just a brand new kind of a thing. And that means there are going to be problems that people haven't thought of yet, and there needs to be some sort of assistance package related to marine offshore in my view.
The biggest obstacles then for expanding aquaculture, we had a great discussion about some of those regulatory pinch points, and then it's the economic investments in building the research and development and getting those small-scale pilot projects up and running so that we can start to develop the sector. So this really just leads us then to the burning question, and Carole, we'll start with you on this one, which is, can we grow and expand aquaculture in the U.S. in a manner that is both economically viable but also environmentally sustainable? And can we do it now?
The answer is absolutely, and it's important to understand that U.S. aquaculture is growing. There have been reports in the press that have not been correct. And I'll just go back to catfish. I've heard no end of comments about the catfish industry, and the reality is that for the past 5-6 years, the U.S. catfish industry has grown in terms of total volume of production. It suffered a contraction at one point, early 2000s up to 2013, but since then it's been growing, and that's the reality. And so we've seen growth in some other sectors. The other food fish sector, we've seen some growth in marine finfish, and so it actually is growing. And the aquaculture done and practiced in the U.S. is done sustainably now. Pond production, as practiced in the U.S., is sustainable. Trout raceway farming is done in a sustainable fashion in the United States, and so shellfish farming is done in a sustainable fashion in the United States. So U.S. aquaculture currently is sustainable. It's growing, but it's growing at a slow rate. And what needs to happen is to speed it up and have a higher rate of growth. And to do that, and addressing some of these issues we've been talking about are very much part of that.
So Gary, you're going to get the last word here. So can we grow and expand aquaculture in the U.S. in a manner that is economically viable and environmentally sustainable, and can we do it now?
Well, I think Carole summed it up very well there. We are already, growing aquaculture products sustainably, and the farmers are doing it, economically viable. They are economically viable. The thing that I see is that the United States has always had great potential for aquaculture production that's never been realized. Back in 1980, when they passed the National Aquaculture Act, there was a vision for an aquaculture industry, and supply, domestic farm-raised seafood, for Americans, a healthy product, a product that generates jobs and contributes to food security because we import so much of our seafood. And unfortunately, that potential that we have, that potential that we saw back then, hasn't been realized. And I think it's important for not only fish farmers and decision makers, politicians, the general public, to support aquaculture, to realize how important it is to the United States in what it provides, the healthy food, again, the jobs primarily in rural areas, and food security. So I think this needs to be that effort to lessen that one regulatory burden that puts constraints on existing farms, and in many cases for other sectors of aquaculture, prohibits them from even establishing a farm. So those need to be lessened, and I don't know what will happen with with the extension folks that are retiring. I've retired. It's not known if my position is going to be replaced or not by the university, and so that is a concern when you see a decrease in research and development and people in aquaculture. With a country that's provided so much information and technology over the decades, that's contributed to aquaculture not only here in the United States but globally. It's strange in that we have all this resource, but overall in aquaculture production, we rank very low, compared to other countries in the world.
Well, I want to thank both of you for taking time out of your retirement to join us. So thank you to Carole and Gary very much for taking your time. Thank you for reminding us that aquaculture is not new globally or in the U.S. In fact, in the U.S., we have some freshwater systems that have been operating for about 100 years. Thank you for reminding us that this is a very diverse sector. Some of the things you touched upon, again, the methods and the species, but it's also about the regulatory environment. It's about the people who are farming these species. And then, of course, we touched on the importance of the regulatory environment and how that can impact growth and expansion, as well as the lack of investment in R&D or limited investment. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you to our audience. Once again, you can visit aquariumpacific.org to get bios and more info from this and other panels in the series. Thank you. Now go eat some seafood. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.